Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this CNA event online today. My name is Nilanthi Samaranayake, and I direct CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis program. We study issues ranging from maritime strategy to managing alliances, nuclear policy, and non-traditional security issues. This is a monthly series of Zoom events where we explore various strategy and policy topics. They're recorded and posted to our website, cna.org/strategy. Now, in the next hour, my co-panelists and I will discuss small states in an era of great power competition. Small states is a topic that has not gotten a lot of attention, especially given the focus in the past few years of great powers and major powers, including adversaries to the United States. Now, with the entry of a new administration, there is a lot of discussion about how to build on or add nuance to the great power competition concept, or GPC for short. So this seems to be a time as any to consider how small states can or should fit in. So we'll look across regions in our discussion today and think about the topic functionally as well. We are delighted to discuss these issues with Professor Wivel from the University of Copenhagen, Ms. Jane Chan from RSIS in Singapore, and Dr. Ralph Espach from CNA. Thanks to you all for being here today. Now, each of us is going to provide introductory remarks for a few minutes. I'll start us off and we'll raise some examples from the smaller South Asian countries. So first, as we think about US strategy towards small states, it's important to consider US alliance partners as well as non-allied strategic partners to the United States. They are all navigating the GPC era and have varying degrees of defense cooperation with the US. Now, in South Asia, the India-Pakistan relationship has dominated the region, given their history of conflicts and nuclear power status. But when looking at the non-India, non-Pakistan, smaller countries of South Asia, the US doesn't have alliance partners. There's actually been a history of difficult US relationships in the region during the Cold War, including with India. Now, this dynamic has helped shape the current state of US ties with smaller South Asian countries. So how should the US balance its own national interests, such as wanting military access or basing, while considering what small states' interests are on their own terms? Second, the role of the dominant country in a region is something that the US should consider, and consider cross-regionally. In South Asia, India is the dominant country, and US-India strategic relations have been deepening for the past several years. But what does this mean for the smaller South Asian countries like Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka? They each navigate their dominant country in the region, India, and its own security prerogatives, with tension sometimes between them. So it presents a complication for US relationships with these countries compared with US ties with India, which arguably have been a focal point in US policy in the wider region for the past 2 decades, namely due to the rise of China. And then third is the issue of small state relationships with the great power competitors, Russia and China. How should the US manage this dynamic, if at all? In South Asia, China plays a meaningful role in infrastructure development and trade with smaller South Asian countries. So how should the US navigate this complex set of relationships, especially with small states that are not US allies? So thinking about these dimensions and looking globally, there are clearly a lot of issues that we'll cover today, as well as Q&A from attendees. So first, let me introduce Dr. Wivel from Denmark. He was recently awarded with full professor status at the University of Copenhagen in the Department of Political Science. So a hearty congratulations, Anis, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. I look very much forward to our discussion. I will talk a little bit about small states in Europe, the challenges faced by the small states in Europe, and the role of the United States. In Europe, you might say all small states are Atlanticist states in the sense that they orient or focus their security policy very much towards the United States. This does not mean that there are not other states that have importance for small state security. Of course, the actions by the United Kingdom, France, also Germany, are important as partners. Russia is important as challenge, and increasingly also China seeking influence in the region, and particularly also through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also in the Arctic part of Europe. Small states in Europe face, in particular, 4 challenges as it is today. The most important challenge, I think, that they face in their security and foreign policy is what we sometimes call the abdication of the United States, which was, of course, very much an issue during the Trump presidency, but also already during Obama presidency, we saw kind of the retraction of the United States, at least the United States playing a lesser role. And small states in Europe are concerned what will happen now with Biden. They're also confident that the Trump policy will change. Biden says America is back. We look forward to that, but also we are curious to see what it will mean in practice. The second challenge is the rise of China. This challenge is kind of twofold. One is the risk of a conflict between China and the United States. That's a problem for small states in Europe, because small states in Europe focus both on China as a trading partner and on the US as a defense partner and as a trading partner. So what will this mean if the United States and China has a conflict, increasingly conflictual relationship? What will this mean for pursuing the interests of these states vis-a-vis China in particular? Then we see the decline of old institutions. This has been a trend that we've seen in Europe for at least 2 decades, so it's not a Trump phenomenon. We would see this as a Trump more as a symptom than as the reason or as the cause of this development. We've seen increased intergovernmentalism in the European Union, the big member states in the European Union pursuing their national interests more directly than they did previously. And that means that institutions as a platform for voice, as a shelter from threats, as a forum for networks for smaller states is challenged both regionally and also increasingly globally because of a retrenchment from the United States in providing the leadership of these organizations. That might change also. And then we see more generally also in the global realm, that's the fourth challenge, a more naked pursuance of national interests. And small states, they seek an institutional environment. They do that because institutions provide shelter against challenges. They provide predictability, which you need if you do not have a lot of resources, and also they provide a platform, at least for voice. So will the Biden presidency change or ameliorate or even end these challenges? I think the answer is a little bit yes and no. It's yes in the sense there's a recommitment to international leadership, also to friends and partners around the world. It's also a yes to the end of these challenges, or at least the amelioration of these challenges, in the sense that we now have more predictability and less disruption than during the Trump presidency. But it also, you might say, is a no, or at least still a challenge when it comes to other issues. I think it's clear from the initial statements from the Biden as a president that Europe does not have a special status in the Biden presidency. The Biden presidency focuses very much also on China and East Asia, and Europe is among the friends and partners, but it does not have the special status that it has had previously. Also, there's a common enemy, you might say, for the West, for the United States, North America, and Europe, in the sense of chaos and disruption. but we do not always see the cause or the origins of disruption and chaos in the same way and coming from the same place. Again, the United States is very much also focused on China and other parts of the world, and Europe is focused very much on what is ours near abroad, that is the Middle East, that is the south and east of Europe, and that is Russia in particular. And then there's the Trump and Sanders legacy, you might say, that also makes it a little bit difficult for smaller states in Europe. You might say smaller states in Europe are old school Atlanticists. We support, in general, institutionalized environment. We support free trade. We support a strong role for the United States as a security provider against Russia, of course, but also creating stability among our friends in Europe, such as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, which were the source of instability and threats for us for centuries. So in that sense, the challenges continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Anis. That was really a great looking across Europe and small states and thinking about the challenges that they're navigating with regard to Russia, China, but also what you discussed in terms of the abdication of the US. That's definitely a theme we're going to want to dig into. Our next speaker is Ms. Jane Chan, Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. Jane is also coordinator of RSIS's Maritime Security Program. We're, of course, grateful that Jane fit us into her busy schedule, but especially so because it is 10 o'clock at night in Singapore. So an extra thanks, Jane, for making time for us to discuss your view on small states.
Thank you, Nilanthi. A very good day, one and all. A quick word of thanks to CNA, especially Nilanthi, for the invitation. Privileged to join this gathering to share my thoughts. So onto the topic at hand. How does a small state like Singapore navigate the troubled US-China relations? You would have heard Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, referring to Singapore as being concerned and anxious. And we don't need to look further than the identities, right, plural, of Singapore to see why. And since I mainly cover maritime issues in my day job, I'm sure you will see through me very quickly on why I deem the following three features of Singapore, or what I refer to as identities, as rather defining for Singapore's policy when dealing with big powers, yeah? So first, as a small state in more ways than one, Singapore has a fundamental interest in the peaceful settlement of international disputes in accordance with international law and its sanctions processes, rather than on the basis that might is right. Second, as an island state, hemmed in by big neighbors, very big neighbors, Singapore relies on international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, to preserve our freedom of navigation and overflight, and we need to ensure that these laws are interpreted and applied consistently. Third, as a Southeast Asian state, right, Singapore has an interest in ensuring that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, remains cohesive and united, and that its processes effectively advance common interests by engendering a high degree of cooperation and integration amongst all member states. So this third identity is the one I will focus on today in the short time that I have. So experts has long assessed that Singapore's relations with the US reveals how Singapore's foreign policy is unmatched with its security policy, right? Singapore continues to support a US presence in the region, with the belief that it is necessary to ensure regional peace, stability, prosperity. However, this task does not only lie with the US, right? We see and we regard a cohesive ASEAN and the maintenance of its centrality within the ASEAN-led multilateral framework as vital to stability in Southeast Asia. So the various regional grouping provides inclusive platform for ASEAN to engage its partners and extra-regional powers. And a key feature built into the ASEAN-led regional architecture is that it is open. So no one single state's influence is supposed to be exclusive, so to speak, right? Not China, not the US. So while being a firm strategic partner of the US, I think Singapore is very mindful of the robust and pragmatic relations we have with China, that it has painstakingly nurtured. So Southeast Asian observers amongst us will know how challenging that has been from time to time. And this is clearly iterated by our Prime Minister, that Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, and I quote here, live at the intersection of the interests of various major powers and must avoid being caught in the middle or forced into invidious choices, end quote. So no doubt we are dealing with a China that is different from the time of Deng Xiaoping. So naturally we see US needing to reassess your grand strategy. So going into the Biden administration, one question that I hear often, at least here in Southeast Asia, is what choices will US make on its role as a global security provider? To me, even if US chooses a narrower path than before, prioritizing its own self-interest, I believe no one in Washington will disagree that a peaceful and stable Asia-Pacific is in US interests. Frankly, in my mind, the locus standi that US enjoys in the region will remain unrivaled for a long time to come. And this is based simply on the fact of China's proximity to Southeast Asia and the correlating social and political baggages that is not often talked about, right? Not to mention the unresolved disputes it has with its neighbors. So in a way, we could say that there are still no good fences to make us good neighbors just yet. But this doesn't mean that China can't mend those fences or that US won't squander its good name. So one last pitch on ASEAN. Power matters, and that the fundamental realities and vulnerabilities of small states have not changed. And that small states like Singapore can do very little to influence big powers. But small states are not entirely without agency, and this is where our Southeast Asian identity comes in, right? Southeast Asian observers has long argued that local responses to power can play and have played significant role in the construction of regional order. So this is where ASEAN, a group of small, I think a better term is weak states when they were first band together. I think this timeline is important reference here is that when ASEAN was first formed, because by all means, Indonesia was not a small state at that point and is definitely not a weak one today. Anyway, back to the point that I was trying to make. So ASEAN as a group of, some small, some weak states have arguably enjoyed a marked degree of influence in shaping regional agenda. So Southeast Asian states continue to look to ASEAN to strengthen their influence as a group and to advance a collective position on issues of common interest. Does it always go as planned? The short answer is no, but that's a totally different seminar altogether. So the Trump administration's clear lack of interest in multilateral diplomacy in Southeast Asia did threaten ASEAN's credibility as a regional convener, so to speak. So if I were to distill my 5 minutes into a one-liner answer to the question that Nilanthi posed to me on what US should do in Southeast Asia, I would say that on top of reinforcing the bilateral relations, which will always be a priority, right? Start investing more time and effort in multilateral institutions in the region. Small states need the goodwill and support from major states to thrive. And the last few years kind of taught many of us in Southeast Asia a key lesson that whatever goodwill and support we are enjoying right now should not be taken for granted. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
That's great, Jane. Thank you for those comments. It's interesting to hear this recurring theme about multilateral institutions. That's something we definitely want to get into. But first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ralph Espach, Senior Research Scientist at CNA in the Adversary Analytics Program. He leads CNA's work on Latin America. Ralph, over to you.
Thank you, Nilanthi. Good morning. Good morning, Anders. Good morning, Jane. Thanks for everyone joining this morning. It's great to see you. I take a slightly different tack in my initial comments. I'm going to talk a little bit early about some factors that are shaping the region now and over the next 5 years. I'm going to dip back because the assumption is that we're talking about great power competition, which would be something like the Cold War, perhaps, in the region. I was just going to point out a few features of the Cold War in the region, and then finish up with what that might project for how we think of regional relations over the next, decade or so. So first of all, the three trends I would highlight over the next few years is, first of all, China has become a major economic player in the region. I think 10 years ago, several of us, including myself, sort of downplayed that and thought that might or might not happen and thought it was being a little exaggerated. But that's, over the years, it's become clear that China is going to maintain a major player in trade and investment across South America in particular, but across the entire region. And those economic processes, that economic presence is going to lead to diplomatic presence, and to cultural influence, and potentially at some point to some security presence, but that may be down a few more years down the road. Second is this is an era of very high political uncertainty and instability in the region. The policy prescriptions, the parties, the programs of the 20th century, such as pro-market reforms and austerity, small government has been completely discredited. Also, socialist left-wing programs for reform right now are at a very weak point because of populism, because of Venezuela. So there isn't a clear set of programs that to be promoted in the region. And there are still the traditional problems of underdevelopment, inequality, and corruption, and a lot of regional frustration. So I would expect a lot of dramatic swings in policy from election to election, as we're seeing now. Even democracies such as Colombia and Peru and Mexico that are longstanding sort of stable actors in the region, I think could enter a period of transformation in their politics, which would be quite interesting. And there will be a lot of openness in the public to radical experiments, as we've seen kind of in the last 15 years. And so there's a lot of opportunism in the GPC environment. And third, natural disasters will continue to be a recurrent problem in the region. We've seen that in the last year in hurricanes with major catastrophic effects in Central America. The pandemic will continue to spread and bring economic problems for at least the next couple of years. So that'll be an additional source of pressure on these governments. And they'll turn to international partners for help. So our assumption is that GPC competition, that the rise of China is going to lead to this GPC competition, which is similar in some ways to the Cold War, to the decades of the Cold War, where there was also sort of a focus on competition in the region. And I'd just like to point a few features of that. One of them is that this brought attention from the United States in the way that in the last couple of decades, Latin America has not received consistent attention across the board from the United States. It's especially in security and defense, but in many other areas as well. The United States, Washington has been drawn away to other regions of the world and not given the region the attention that it used to. And of course, during the Cold War, this took of numerous forms. There was the Alliance for Progress, which was technical assistance and development assistance and nutritional programs, et cetera, trying to wean governments away from the lure of communism. There were, of course, CIA operations in Chile and Guatemala. There were institution building programs, which unfortunately worked best for militaries more than they did for competent bureaucracies. And there were, of course, armed invasions. So this takes several forms, but we could probably predict that if great power competition characterizes inter-American relations over the next 10 years, you will see more attention from the United States to the region. But this was also a time of radical experimentation in domestic and foreign policy on the part of the small states in the region. There were leftist reform governments who were trying to address longstanding problems and public demands for equality and growth. And there were public support for radical socialism. Small governments acted pragmatically, mostly to help their domestic prospects, and they embraced communism at times, and at other times they, of course, eschewed communism and joined the United States in persecuting it. And in several cases, military leaders saw the chance to seize power, and democracy was compromised, with the U.S. acceptance and support in many of those cases in the name of ensuring security and stability. But I think the key point is that these small nations tended to be very pragmatic, not ideological in their behavior during that time. Leaders were pursuing strategically rational interests, largely at the domestic level as much as the international level, and they used great power competition sometimes to their advantage in order to win the approval of constituencies or their own parties, or of course to maintain themselves in power. So given that, what can we project, or how can we think about that going forward in the region? Well, there's a big difference, right? I think China and the Soviet Union are quite different actors and bring different strengths and behaviors. The Soviet Union at that time was, of course, very ideological. Its opposition to the United States, and it spread around this global interests. And it was disruptive in Latin America, largely through Cuba, but it had a disruptive ideological agenda in the view of Washington, or from the perspective of Washington. Whereas China, up to now anyway, has been neutral in its approach. It's after its own interests. It needs the resources. It wants the trade. It wants to exploit opportunities for its own companies and industries. But largely, it's neutral and tolerant in regard to the countries it trades with. It trades and sells largely to U.S. key partners more than it does to the pariah states of Venezuela and Nicaragua, for example, which you would expect would seek more China ties. And it's also seeking, Beijing up to now has been non-disruptive in its behavior in the region. Its investments tend to be economic and diplomatic, and they tend to avoid, outright competition with the United States in the region, although that may be shifting. So looking forward, what might we expect? I think the region will remain divided as it is today, politically and ideologically, that is within the region, in different forms of government and different attitudes to the government. And this undermines their ability to act in a unified manner. It undermines international institutions and regional institutions, which were an important component of Cold War politics, trying to strengthen collective action against the great power, the United States. Most of the countries will probably take various strategic pathways under great power competition. They'll seek the best ways of benefiting from Chinese trade and investment while keeping good relations with their historic, cultural, and partners in U.S. and Europe. And the leaders will show pragmatism. But this does mean there'll be a lot of space for opportunism, I think, and for small nations to take certain risks in terms of working with China. And they'll try to feel out maybe perhaps what risks they can take with investment and deals with China up until the point of becoming intolerant, facing U.S. intoleration, right? And so a lot of it depends on what U.S. sees as red lines and how China's willing to act towards those. Also, Latin America will tend, and the small states in particular, would tend to be of low strategic importance to both parties. This has been true for a long time, and the United States even more so has less appetite than it did for military adventures in the region. And most of the region remains of marginal geostrategic importance, with the exception of the Caribbean Basin and Central America for the United States. So it's very difficult to see these countries being affected or being pulled into a major conflict like you might see in other areas of the world, which takes some pressure off of them. And this means, I think, that a lot of the global competition we'll see will continue to be at the economic level, it'll be diplomatic, there'll be competition over cultural influence and technologies used in deals and things, but we can be optimistic it won't spill over into security and defense. The big question is, what is the United States capable of doing in the region? And what is it willing to do as compared to before and as compared to the policies it's had in the past? If the U.S. continues to be paralyzed politically and to lurch left and right and on and off as it has over the last couple of administrations, I think Washington will be less and less influential because it's less and less capable of offering meaningful help to address the problems the region face. And if so, then I think China's Belt and Road Initiative and other non-aligned development initiatives in the region will continue to spread, despite some cultural resistance and some wariness on the part of those countries. And I think we'll see increasing Chinese influence because it'll be helping to solve those problems. On the other hand, if the United States can find a way, increase its helpfulness and can communicate that and can show that effectively, I think the United States obviously has several advantages demographically, culturally, and while China will still be in the region, I think the affairs will still largely tilt towards inter-American cooperation and some degree of getting along despite turmoil. So I'll stop right there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ralph. We've done a global tour here, stretching across 4 regions. It's really interesting to hear your thoughts, especially on the role of non-traditional security issues and how that plays out in Latin America. Jane, first to everybody, we'll have a bit of discussion in this next section of our seminar, but listeners, please start submitting your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom part of the screen. But Jane, I want to throw the first question over to you. I was really intrigued to hear your comments about essentially the the painstakingly nurtured ties that Singapore has cultivated with China. It really gives an insight into small state calculus. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about, you mentioned the importance of open architecture for Singapore and really more of that inclusive approach to navigating international affairs. Can you comment on the Quad and how that relates to how Singapore has to navigate this issue of great power competition and perhaps a tension there in terms of that desire for an open architecture?
Indeed. So drawing your comment on China and the Quad, I think, there's no surprise in terms of how China has been responding to developments in the Quad. And, they have, and China indeed, has conveyed some of their feelings about the Quads to most Southeast Asian countries, right? So in a way, increasingly there's a lot of talk about Quad Plus, right? Where the Southeast Asian countries are interested to participate as the plus countries to the Quad. But the underlying question that most Southeast Asian countries will have, including Singapore, will be, to what end, is the Quad supposed to do in terms of, engaging the region vis-a-vis China. Right. So if you want to dissipate the narrative that is a institution to contain China, right? That is the narrative, right? It's not to contain China, it's to engage the region, to bring in, especially India to the fold, to bring in more, major powers in the region. But how should I say, the vision is one that, doesn't quite gel with, how major powers has been engaging Southeast Asia and the narrative of, how this is supposed to support Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis China. I think that in itself is not entirely clear. And one of these examples would be, the talk about the Indo-Pacific region and the Indo-Pacific policy, right? So, you see, amongst the all four Quad countries, all four countries espouse a somewhat different, right, vision of a Indo-Pacific strategy, so to speak. Some, they don't even call it a strategy, right? So you would see that, the Southeast Asian countries really struggle. And in the end, they came out with their own, statement of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, right? In a way, it's not supposed to be a strategy as you know it to be, right? But if we look beyond just the very, I would say, simplistic pronouncement or in the AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook of Indo-Pacific, my reading of it is more a outcry of the ASEAN countries saying that, look, we really don't want to be put in a position where, we are favoring, one vision over the other, right? This is the Southeast Asian, expression of how we see, the region increasingly bringing in, more and more stakeholders, right? To now bring in the Indian Ocean as well. But it's not just a geographical reference, so to speak, right? And you see that, it emphasized a lot more on, the Southeast Asian agenda. So it's somewhat, trying to pull, in my reading, is somewhat trying to pull some of these major powers to say that, yes, we understand that, you coming together, setting up, the Quad or, conveying, a strategy, trying to get buy-in in Southeast Asia. A lot of these, we saw them as, yes, a conveyance of, your interest in the region. But how are you doing that, in taking into consideration the Southeast Asian interest? I think that is where the gap is, right? And that is where, there is always a challenge in trying to get a buy-in of not just one, because if you're talking about Southeast Asia, you do need, the entire group to be able to say that, hey, this is, perhaps a direction that we can go with. So in that sense, to say that the Quad is not inclusive. Now they have the Quad Plus. So, you can say that it's trying to respond to some of the, the feedback from Southeast Asia. But, I believe that the Quad countries will need to do a lot more in trying to assuade the Southeast Asian countries to say that, look, by coming on board, whether you come on board officially as, a plus country, or, you express that there is a buy-in into the Quad agenda, it doesn't put you in a direct confrontation path with China. I think that message ought to be very, very clear.
Thank you, Jane. That's really interesting to hear how you conceived it. We've talked a bit about institutions and frameworks throughout our discussion, but hearing your views from the region about the evolution and perceptions, and how some of the Southeast Asian countries have helped shape the evolution of Quad to Quad Plus, and essentially that approach to institutions and frameworks. Anas, I want to go to you next, because it was interesting to hear your point about how Europe does not appear to have special status in the Biden administration, just given the priorities in the Indo-Pacific. I talked a bit about South Asia before. I just thought it was really interesting to hear that topic of perceptions of strategic importance for the U.S. In both your presentation, Anas, and also Ralph. Taking a step back, you look Latin America. That's the U.S.'s home area, or Monroe Doctrine approach, and then Europe. You actually have an alliance structure in Europe, unlike in a lot of the Indo-Pacific. So, can you talk a bit, Anas, about what you were really getting at in terms of that issue about the priority of Europe for the United States?
Well, I think that first of all, I think there are some good reasons why the United States sees Europe as less central than before. And obviously, during the Cold War, we had a common enemy, the Soviet Union, which was both in ideological terms and in terms of military threat, a common enemy, and also an enemy that was very functional, I think, for the transatlantic relationship, because the Soviet Union kept on reminding us about all the things that we shared, both in terms of liberal democratic values and in terms of security interests. So in that sense, that formed, of course, the basis of NATO, and also of a strong transatlantic relationship with a strong U.S. presence. And I think it's in a sense a logical development, as when you see that another global challenger is rising to the United States, China, that a global superpower, that the United States will turn its attention towards China and away from Europe. I think Russia is a challenger in the sense of being able to disrupt. Russia is also a challenger to states in the immediate vicinity of Russia, but of course Russia is not a state or a power of global strength as the United States is, and as China has also become. I think also that there are some good, demographic reasons for why the United States do not see a strong response to Europe as it did before. If you look at migration patterns in the United States, the migration from Europe is not what it was in the past, and the demography in the United States is changing, and naturally, I would say, making both Latin America and Asia a stronger interest for the United States, also because it's becoming a stronger interest for the U.S. electorate and the U.S. Population. I think also there's a historical reason, in the sense that there's a generational reason, that all the things that brought us together across the Atlantic was very much also connected to the Second World War and to the Cold War. And that is kind of thinning out the remembrance of these issues, and perhaps it should be because perhaps a lot of it is not as functional as it used to be. And then I think there's a an additional reason also, and I think that is that that Europeans have just been, in my mind, incredibly bad as at explaining to the United States why they should continue to have an interest in Europe, and a strong interest in Europe. I think the United States has been asking this question of Europeans for decades, since the end of the Cold War. I think in the past 4 years it was asked in a less diplomatic way than it had been previously. But I'm puzzled why the Europeans have not tried to answer it in a more constructive and forward-looking way. It seems that many European leaders turn towards the past and the bonds that we have and our shared history when they're explaining why the United States should still spend a lot of money and a lot of troops and military capability on a, I would say, very stable and very rich continent such as the United States. And I think if the Europeans are going to make a convincing case for continued strong US engagement, I think they need to make the case why this is good for the United States and why it's good for the international order that the United States also seeks to further. And I think there are various ways that we can do that. I think one way of doing it is continuing the course that we have now with our defense spending. I think one good thing that came out of the Trump presidency was the Europeans increasingly taking it seriously that we have to contribute more towards our own defense, both in terms of moving, I know it's slowly, but at least moving towards the 2% of GDP target for our defense budgets and the 20% target for procurement out of defense budgets. And I think if you look over the recent years, you've seen that actually we have strengthened European defense. Then I think the Europeans should make a stronger case for why that they are moving towards what they sometimes call strategic autonomy. I think they should be very careful to make the case that this is not to replace the United States. We cannot do that. It would take, even if Europeans agreed upon what security challenges and threats we face, it would probably take us 20 years to replace the security and defense capabilities that we get from the United States. And we do not agree on what threats we see in the north and east, where I come from in Denmark. We look to the Arctic, we look to Russia. If you're a country in the Mediterranean, you look more to Northern Africa and the Middle East. So we should make the case, how can we supplement NATO with European capabilities? How can we play a stronger role in stabilizing so what is to the south of Europe, what is to the east of Europe? What role can Europeans play in regard, stronger role in regard to NATO partnership countries? I think that is important also. And then also to stress where we are strong now and developing also now in terms of climate security, environmental security. How can we work with the United States in order to develop these capabilities, in order, for instance, warning systems on disasters? How can we use this in order to connect partnership countries closer also to NATO, in order also to counter the Belt and Road initiatives and the benefits that you can get from participating in that. And then I think we need to work more constructively also with the United States on trade. Respect that Trump and I think to some extent Biden have a different trade agenda than what we saw in the past. There's more concern now in the United States with the protection of vulnerable industries, with protection of particular segments on the labor market, and that needs to be factored into a new trade deal between the United States and Europe. And quite frankly, we should be able to do that in Europe, because if you look at the European Union, and the kind of basic bargain that kind of founded the European Union. It was a basic bargain, fundamental bargain between Germany and France, very much allowing Germany market access and giving also some concessions to France in terms of protection of vulnerable industries. So we should be able to reach a compromise where we respect each other's vulnerabilities, but still promote free trade. And together we have the economic, I would say, muscle to create some common standards also on technology, market access, that perhaps could set the standard also in competition with China and other rivals.
Thank you, Hannes. That was a very informative answer. As we're thinking cross-regionally here, it's been fascinating. You mentioned the strategic autonomy, that discussion in Europe. Thinking in the South Asian case, it means something a little bit different. So it's fascinating to hear, in the European context, essentially, it's not a replacement for the U.S. or the alliance, but it's very much, not the case in India, which often uses that phrase of strategic autonomy. We have about 15 minutes left and the chat is really blowing up, which I think is a good sign that we're talking about something really interesting and important. If everybody will continue to use the Q&A function to add their questions so I could track it. And then Ralph, I'm just going to go to you to start the first question from Brian. Do you expect small states to reach a point where hedging strategies are no longer viable and the great powers will force them to choose a side to align with? Is non-alignment akin to what we saw in the Cold War still feasible in the current GPC context?
I think history suggests that these countries these countries are far away from the countries in Latin America. The small countries in Latin America are far away from being in a position of being of such a national security importance to the United States that the United States would push them into that draconian position of making a choice. And I say that because in the run up to the Second World War, there were a lot of German activities and presence trying to turn these countries and trying to build its presence there, which the U.S. tolerated. There were some Japanese outreach, and then it didn't reach. And even after the war had begun, it wasn't important. There were other things of much more importance to the United States than worrying about the policies in these countries. And so it was on the less burner until there were submarine attacks, right? Until it became part of a kinetic war. And then the United States relatively quickly worked with intelligence in these countries and put leverage on these countries, and their neutrality became very painful for them. I don't see, unless China and the United States strategic competition elevates very quickly, I don't think that's likely in Latin America in the near term.
Excuse me. Jane, why don't we take John's question next? These comments have addressed major elements of national power, diplomatic, military, and economic. What is the view on the information environment? Competitors are increasingly using tactics, techniques, and procedures focused on disinformation. It's an attractive low-cost option to shape a population. Is there a role for small states to play, considering the threat this poses?
The cyber domain is definitely not my area of expertise, but indeed, we can see Singapore being extremely concerned, right, about, this information. And, rather than addressing the question on the role of the small state and how we do that, I think, to address that element first and foremost is, I think right now there is a clear lack of, international rules. So there's still no clear convention as we have with the, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in managing the cyber domain in that sense. So this is where, given that, most of the UN states are small states, I believe, small states will have a lot to say in helping to set the rules in those domains. But if I can draw this back to, the challenges it poses to small states as well, is that very often when small states faces some of these problems, it may not get as much attention as, if a big agency in the United States got hacked. And that becomes problematic because if these tactics are being employed on small states systematically without gaining a lot of attention, I think that will become very problematic very, very quickly. But Nilanthi, if I may also, since I have the floor, to address the question of the rule of law, the maritime rule of law, because, I see these as, again, related to a few of the China question as well, vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. I think when it comes to the problems that we see in maritime Southeast Asia and the issue of the rule of law, a lot of it draw its core to an inconsistent interpretation of international law. Inconsistency between China and the Southeast Asian states, inconsistency between how US and China interprets the rule, the international law, and how they apply and enforce these, and that then percolates to the territorial disputes and maritime disputes, that percolates to how coastal states are enforcing in waters where it may run contravention to how user states interpret their rights in these waters. There is a clear disjuncture in terms of how we talk about freedom of navigation. Very often, China was referring to commercial freedom of navigation versus, what the US and some others are talking about, freedom of navigation of military activities, right? So in that sense, to answer the question of the rule of law it may sound very simplistic in terms of, in trying to say that, this is the root cause, but it's also the most problematic one, because there is no platform, right, for us to come together once again to say, this is how you interpret it, right? So that becomes highly problematic. And in a way, I can see, if we draw this back to the cyber question as well, and this information, which may or may not be cyber, because we have seen tactics being employed in Southeast Asia that is not, employed at the cyber, domain, right? It is percolating to, diaspora in Southeast Asian countries already. But to that point of, as we are trying to set new rules, right, in a brand new domain, I think this becomes very, very important. To the definition and the application ought to be, agreed upon, that it has to be consistent. It cannot be a regional approach, because that seems to be the trend now, right? That there needs to be a regional interpretation of certain international law, and that, I think, would be a huge no-no, especially for small states. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Anas, I'm going to go to you next. We have a question from Dove. In light of your remarks, what is your reaction to the Munich conference this past Friday? And I'll add on to that a question from Eleanor. The perceived abdication of American interest in Europe that you discussed, how does that change small European states' view of investment in the EU?
I think that the EU is by small EU member states considered still very much a priority, and also I think also something that we need in the way that we have constructed now our political economies around the European marketplace over the past decades. So in that sense, the EU has become indispensable. And that goes also for some of the small states in Europe that are not EU members, but are members of the European Economic Agreement. That they prefer to stay outside the EU, but they still want to be part of the marketplace and in many ways the political economy of the EU. So I think when it comes to that, I think it's indispensable for small states. It also created an institutional structure for discussions among EU member states. So I might say that we quite often complain. I think that's in all EU member states that it's very bureaucratic. It's some of the same criticisms that you have against the UN. It's very bureaucratic. It's too much talk. It's too little action. But still. It works better than we knew before we had the EU, and it has created a marketplace that has allowed us to grow and also create much more effective economies that we could have done without the EU, with the fairly large welfare states that we have in Europe, and the fairly small markets also that we have in small states in Europe. So I think that's quite indispensable. I think in terms of security, I think what the EU does in terms of security is very different from what NATO does. I think what the EU has created in Europe is a process of constant negotiation. And that means also a constant information sharing, much more transparency on what other states think and what they will do. And in that sense also, it creates a community of states where we do no longer, of course, fear the European great powers as we did in the past, and as we did up until the Second World War. I think in terms of now moving on to security, I think the Munich Security Conference has not had as much attention this year as it had in previous years in Europe. I think a lot of the attention in Europe right now is going into to the Biden presidency and what to expect from the Biden presidency, and trying to kind of dissect. I would say not every word of President Biden, but definitely the signals coming from the president and from his administration. I think that two takeaway points from that. I think one is that I think across Europe there's a relief of hearing the America's back message from President Biden. There's been a lot of attention given to the Thucydides trap of maybe having this rivalry ending in war between China and the United States. I think in Europe we're perhaps more concerned with the Kindleberger trap, identified by Professor Nye, that there will be no hegemon in international affairs. There will be no one taking responsibility and leadership. So that's one takeaway point, that we are kind of hopeful that U.S. leadership is back, in particular from smaller states. And another takeaway point, I think, is awareness, I think, and the curiosity towards the Biden project of an alliance for democracy, because you could say that in Europe we think we have an alliance for democracy with the United States. It's called NATO. It was there since the early Cold War. So what's this new alliance for democracy? And I think we see a lot of prospect in that, in terms that these liberal democratic values underpinning the order as we knew it for decades, led by the United States, has been very beneficial to Europe. But I think also there's some concern if this alliance of democracies is also an alliance against China, and what will this mean to the position of the European countries seeking security, shelter, and cooperation with the United States, but also in particular in economic affairs, seeking a strong relationship with China.
Thanks very much, Anis. It's really interesting, excuse me, to hear the recurring thread of international institutions in your remarks, and talking about how small states seek shelter. Jane, how you mentioned the role of international law, essentially those types of institutions and frameworks in helping small states to navigate some of these great power challenges. Just in the interest of time, we only have a couple minutes. Liz, I'll take your question question about South Asia offline. And then Ralph, just in our last couple minutes, if you could answer Aaron's question, could you explain the comment that South American states are of low strategic interest to both the US and the PRC? And she cites a lot of the PRC's issues about resource scarcity, and the supporting supply chain for those interests suggests South and Latin America are of strategic interest.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. South America has become a major trade exporter of key goods to China, and of course, it's a major exporter of the United States and a major trade part of the United States. But even so, it's not to the level, I'm saying relatively speaking, it's not to the level of, say, the Middle East and South Asia in terms of the supply chains for oil and energy to China. It's hard to see South America reaching the point that where it's of that type of strategic importance. Now, that doesn't mean things won't happen. That doesn't mean the countries don't have geostrategic interests, and it means that there's a wide level or wide scope for playing around in the region of maybe not naval bases, but operational locations, and maybe not permanent fixtures, but a lot of intelligence work and undermining covert work and that sort of thing. That's what we saw in the Cold War, and I think that could go on. But I was trying to make the point that I don't think it's going to be a venue where the two countries are going to position themselves for potential conflict. Again, outside of, say, the Panama Canal area and the Caribbean basin, which the United States takes very seriously. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Anas. I think we've really only scratched the surface of small states in great power competition, because there are so many questions on chat and Q&A, and we just haven't had time to get to all of them. But I think it suggests that we need to keep looking into this topic and researching it, because this issue of strategic competition, it's not going away anytime soon. So thank you everyone for joining today. Of course, Anas, Jane, Ralph, for sharing your thoughts and on our world tour of small states across the regions. Excuse me. Thank you, the audience, for your excellent questions and comments. I hope we can all stay in touch on this important topic. Just for your calendar planning, everyone, our next event is going to be on March 24th, and we're going to discuss high seas resources, ocean security, and the great powers. My colleagues are going to talk about specifically the agreement that's under negotiation at the UN on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and the UN Convention Law of the Sea, high seas fishing, and deep seabed resources. So March 24th, please mark your calendars. Thank you, everybody, for joining our event today. We'll see you soon.